Varmt välkomna till dagens möte i Nationalekonomiska Föreningen. Idag är det en prisceremoni och prisföreläsning för Assar Lindbeck-medaljen. For those of you who doesn't understand Swedish, the introduction will be in English and the introduction will be in Swedish, and then the lecture and the following discussion will be in English. So please be with me for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get over into English. Så varmt välkomna till den här prisceremonin och prisföreläsning om utdelande av 2019 års pristagare av Assar Lindbeck-medaljen. Jag heter Magnus Henrekson, jag är ordförande i Nationalekonomiska Föreningen och ska dela ut det här priset. Den här presentationen och prisföreläsningen skulle egentligen ha ägt rum vid Nationella konferensen i höstas, men det blev uppskjutet på grund av pandemin, så nu gör vi det här separat. Bakgrunden till det här priset, det instiftades 2007 i syfte att främja nationalekonomisk forskning i Sverige och hedra Assar Lindbecks mångskiftande och banbrytande insatser inom området. Det har delats ut vartannat år sedan 2007. Och i år är det alltså 2019 års pristagare som får priset. Sen kommer det utlysas igen, och så är det en pristagare för 2021 som kommer att sen presentera på Nationella konferensen 2022. Det här går till en forskare som är verksam i Sverige och är inte äldre än 45 år. Som säkert de flesta av er känner till gick Assar Lindbeck bort förra året. Hans betydelse och genomslag, det kan inte överskattas, betydelsen för svensk nationalekonomi. Och Assar, han var aktiv in i det sista. Han gick bort vid 90,5 års ålder och arbetade fram till, skulle jag säga, månaden innan han gick bort. Och för er som läser tidskriften Ekonomisk debatt, vilket jag hoppas att ni alla gör, så kommer nästa nummer att vara helt tillägnat, ett temanummer tillägnat Assar Lindbeck, med Stefan Svallfors som gästredaktör. Och det är ett stort antal, 14 stycken bidrag. Det finns också bilder på Assars den konstnärliga delen av Assars verksamhet och annat. Väldigt fint nummer. Med det sagt, så över till årets pristagare. Och det är professor Anna Dreber Almenberg vid Handelshögskolan, som är professor här sedan 2016. Och sysslar i första hand med experimentell ekonomi, om förutsättningar för samarbete och könsskillnader i relation till konkurrens är det som har lyfts fram mest i prismotiveringen. På senare år har Anna haft ett enormt genomslag för sin forskning för att undersöka och förbättra experimentella forskningens tillförlitlighet. Och är oerhört välciterad. De senaste åren ungefär 3000 citeringar i Google Scholar. Och nu tänker inte jag säga mer om detta, utan nu ska jag överlämna priset till Anna. Så Anna, kom fram här, så är det jättesnäll. Och det är lite olika komponenter i det här priset. Jag tycker ju den viktigaste delen, det är väl olika preferenser man har, men jag tycker den viktigaste delen är själva Assar Lindbeck-medaljen. Det är alltså en medalj som Anna Winblad Jakubowski har designat, formgivit. Och på baksidan av den här medaljen så finns ett självporträtt av Assar. Och hela medaljen är väldigt mycket Assar Lindbeck, tycker jag, präglar Assar Lindbeck. Det är stil, det är en kärv stil, inte sådär en väldigt, ja, den är väldigt speciell, så att i äkta silver, så det tycker jag är den viktigaste delen. Och sen vet inte jag om du tycker den här är viktigare, men i vilket fall som helst, andra delen är en check från Swedbank, eller utställd av Swedbank, på prissumman som är 250 000 kronor. Så det hoppas jag att du har hittat någon användning för. Varsågod. Absolut. Och en blombukett. Grattis. Tack. Nu får man inte krama så här eller så.
Ja, corona.
Stort grattis. Ja, verkligen stort grattis. Tack. Så att nu är det dags för prisföreläsningen också. Och det är på temat kan vi lita på forskningsresultaten, och den heter på engelska Which scientific results can we trust? Ja, det borde det heta. Och Anna will talk for about 35 minutes, and then Stefan Svallfors, who's a professor at Södertörns University College and also in charge of humanities and social sciences at Vetenskapsrådet. He will be discussant, and there will be no, I'm afraid there will be no room for questions from the audience this time. So but please stay. I'm sure it's going to be very, very interesting. So the floor is yours, Anna.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to Nationalekonomiska Föreningen, to the jury that awarded me this prize. To all of you listening to this, don't hesitate to send me your emails with questions and comments. So if we can't have a Q&A session here, we can do it offline or online later. So I'm super honored and happy to be here, of course, and to have received this award. It's a great honor. And I have many people to thank. I have tons of co-authors. If I would name all of them, I would spend the rest of today until 1 just mentioning their names. So there are many people to thank. I want to point out 2 people in particular. So first, my husband, Johan Almenberg, who's also an economist, and we worked a lot in the past. And yeah, we don't have any projects right now, but he's been of key in making me think about how to forecast results, whether the results replicate using prediction markets. And then I would also like to thank Magnus Henrekson, who's also here at the Stockholm School of Economics. And we have many past collaborations, many ongoing, and many future collaborations, and which is, for me, of course, fantastic. And thanks, everyone, for being here in various forms. Okay, so I would like to start with a phenomena that I've discussed in the past and that I keep coming back to because I think it illustrates some of the ways things can go wrong. So that's a phenomenon called power posing. So power posing is based on a study with 42 participants who were randomized to either stand or sit in a so-called high power position with your arms behind your head, for example, or your arms in your waist, like on the slide, versus sitting or standing in a so-called low power position, basically hugging yourself. And in the original study that was published in 2010 in Psychological Science, a top psychology journal, the authors claimed that power posing, the high power pose, leads to dramatic behavioral and hormonal changes. So if you stand or sit like this for a minute or 2, you get higher testosterone levels, higher risk-taking, lower cortisol, so lower stress, and an increase in feelings of power. So that's just completely amazing. And if you're going to go to that job interview for your dream job, you should power pose, or before an important talk like this, I should power pose in order to perform well. And here on the slide, you see the risk-taking results. So those in the high power condition are statistically significantly more risk-taking than those in the low power condition. The problem is when we redo this study, and by we, I mainly mean Eva Ranehill, who's now at the University of Gothenburg, a fantastic researcher. When we redo the study, we basically find nothing. So on the slide, you can see the risk-taking results. There's no difference between the high power group and the low power group. And we have about 5 times the original sample here and basically find nothing. So I'm picking on this particular study, but there's nothing special about power posing. There are many similar studies in psychology, but also in economics and related fields. And I think, of course, as in many other instances, the authors here were trying to do something interesting, exploring how the world works and trying to make us learn something new here. The problem is when you do something like this, testing a very spectacular hypothesis in a low-powered sample with many degrees of freedom in how to do the analysis, things can go wrong, and they seem to go wrong repeatedly, and that's something we want to address. Okay, so this talk could also have been called the catchy title, How Researcher Degrees of Freedom, and what this means, something I will get back to, and low statistical power have led to a replication crisis, and how we should design studies and do pre-analysis plans and multiverse analysis and change incentives, etc. There are many things to do here. All of this should be done in order to solve the problem with the replication crisis. I'm mainly going to talk about the experiments, but there are no reasons to think that this is just an experimental problem. If anything, I think the problems are worse for non-experimental data for various reasons, and I will come back to this. This is not just a social science problem. Similar issues have been found in medicine and related fields. So I think we can learn from looking at other fields as well. Okay, so which results can we actually trust? There will be false results in the scientific literature for various reasons. I mean, one reason will be that we have scientific con artists who fabricate data. So on the slide here, you see a few infamous examples of scientific con artists who make up data and publish them in top journals. So to your left, you have the infamous Wakefield et al. Paper that's claimed that MMR vaccines, so the triple dose of vaccine, which contained the measles vaccine, led to autism in kids. This paper turned out to be fake. It's been retracted, but it continues to live its own life. So it's not that easy to deal with false results and make sure that they're actually weeded out of our collective intelligence. There are two other examples here, and there are, of course, many more. So when I talk about false results, I don't mean results like these. I think that most false results do not stem from psychopaths like these guys, but stem from good researchers trying to do good research and end up fooling themselves and others into thinking that they found something, whereas in fact nothing is going on. So I think these type of researchers are a small minority in research, including economics, and that's a good thing. So how many published claims are false if we do not consider those types of con artists? That's going to depend on a lot of things, like the type 1 error rate. What's the false positive probability of our tests? The type 2 error rate. What statistical power do we have to find an effect that actually exists? And it's going to depend on publication bias. So publication bias works in different ways. So we as researchers typically don't write up null results because they're hard to publish. Scientific journals prefer interesting, novel, big claims where something is found. And if we do a study on, say, power posing, and nobody had studied that before, and we claim power posing has no effect, who cares? Nobody would care, because why would you think power posing has an effect? So in that case, maybe there are a good reason for why we wouldn't publish such a null result. But in many other instances, null results are just not considered because they're not as interesting. And in the figure here, or on the slide, you see a figure from a very nice paper by Franco et al. Published in Science a few years ago, where they follow the fate of different social science experiments that are basically pre-registered. So they can see that null results are very unlikely to be written up. So they remain in the researcher's file drawer, whereas strong results, meaning statistically significant results, are of course very likely to be published, and there are very few of them in the so-called file drawer. So publication bias is a problem. We also have reasons to worry about power problems in economics. There's a paper by Ioannidis et al. Where they go through a large set of empirical economics literatures and find that median power in economics is about 18%. Another study looks at dictator game experiments, so one of the most commonly used games in behavioral economics. Median power here is 25%. Together with Magnus Henrekson and David Billén, I have a recent study looking at the gender gap in dictator game giving. This is a game where many of us had a prior that there would be a gender gap. When we do a meta-analysis here and then find the meta-analytic effect size and go back to individual studies to find what statistical power do these studies have to find the meta-analytic effect size, we find that the median study has 9% power to find this gap. So again, a heavily underpowered field. And low power can be problematic for many reasons, of course. I mean, low power makes it hard to find true effects that actually exist. And given that we find something statistically significant and we have low power, chances are very high that we have inflated effect sizes. And there's even a probability that the true effect is even in the opposite direction of what we find. There are also the various researcher degrees of freedom that affect the share of results that we can trust in the scientific literature. So we all know we shouldn't go on a fishing expedition, just widely correlating variables with each other. By chance, something will end up significant, even if we only test results that are hypotheses that are false. But then there are these other ways to analyze data that are more natural, but can also lead to meaningless p-values. like p-hacking and forking from the so-called garden of forking paths. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about these practices because I think they are key explanations for what we find in our replication projects. When it comes to p-hacking, when we're in the world of experiments, there are many ways to get a statistically significant result, a p less than 0.05. If you do an experiment, you can stop collect data once you have a statistically significant result. So I do my experiment. I have my control and treatment that I randomize participants to. So I'm in the best of causal worlds. But I look at the data at the end of every day and see, do I now have something statistically significant? If I don't, I keep collecting data. And if I do, I stop. Another way is to analyze many measures. I include many outcome variables in my study, but I only report those where I find statistical significance. The third way would be that I collect and analyze many conditions, but I only report those with p less than 0.05. I can use covariates or control variables in my regression. At some point, something would be statistically significant. I can exclude participants to get p less than 0.05, and I can transform the data to get p less than 0.05. At the end of the day, all of these practices lead to meaningless p-values where the false positive probability can be more than 50% when I have a p less than 0.05 result. Another common phenomena that is maybe even more natural for a researcher is what's called forking. And this is basically a multiple testing problem where the number of tests is not clear. It's going to depend on your data. So you basically let the data decide the analysis, even when you're testing a hypothesis. Do I find something in my first test? If not, I can start looking into men or women or older versus younger individuals, etc. Subgroup analysis are typically sort of part of the forking expedition. And at the end of the day, something will be statistically significant somewhere, but the p-value here is a pretty meaningless number. And we like p-values and want them to be meaningful. So then we should avoid forking. But forking is so natural and will occur unless you have a pre-analysis plan. So which results can we actually trust in the scientific literature? That's going to depend on many different things. The p-value of the tests, the statistical power of the test, how severe publication bias do we have in our field, how much are we engaging in the various researcher degrees of freedom, and what is the prior of the hypothesis being tested. So by prior here, I mean the probability that the hypothesis is true before it's even tested. This is not something we typically incorporate into the statistical process here because priors are subjective and hard to access. And I think we have a way to get at priors from using, for example, prediction markets. Okay, so that was a long intro to what we have actually done during the last few years. So now I would like to talk a little bit about our replication and prediction projects. So I'm going to talk about these projects that we've done in collaboration with many other researchers in psychology, experimental economics. We've replicated nature and science, social science experiments. We've elicited peer beliefs about replication outcomes using prediction markets and surveys for the aforementioned projects, plus some other projects, mainly in psychology. We also have other various forecasting surveys where we're trying to see whether there is some wisdom of crowds in predicting research outcomes. And I will also talk about more fairly recent project using many analysts on the same data that we published last year. And as I said earlier, this is joint work with lots of people. So you see here a picture of Magnus Henrekson because he's the constant person across all of these projects. So what do I mean when I say that we do a replication? I basically mean that we take an experiment, we try to have the same methods and materials as in the original study, and then we redo the experiment on a new and larger sample. So ideally, we should have high statistical power in this replication. We say that a study replicates if we find an effect in the same direction as the original study with a p-value that is less than 0.05 in a two-sided test. So we don't need to find an effect size that is as big as the original one, but our replication effect needs to be in the same direction as the original one and statistically significant. There are also other ways to measure replication success, like relative effect size. How big is the replication's effect size compared to the original effect size? And we find that when we have high power in our replications, the various replication indicators basically converge, which is a good thing. I will mainly now talk about what we call direct replications, meaning that we try to keep things as close as possible to the original study. In a conceptual replication, you would instead on purpose vary something in the original study and see to what extent can we find the same results. To what extent are the original results generalizable to a slightly different context. The line is a bit blurry between direct and conceptual, but I want to think that we have mainly done direct replications here. Okay, so I will be super brief about the big replication project in psychology. This was a project that was published in 2015 in the journal Science, where we were 270 authors, out of which 4 of us were here at SSE at the time, where the goal was to replicate as many experiments and other types of studies as possible from 3 top psychology journals published in 2008. At the end of the project deadline, 100 replications had been completed, and power here was supposed to be high. Power was on average 92% to detect the original effect size, to detect 100% of the original effect size. If we actually think that even true effects will be inflated, this might lead to too low power, which is something I will come back to. So what were the outcomes from this big project that took many years and was led by Brian Nosek and his team at the University of Virginia? Well, out of these 100 original results, 97 had positive effects that were statistically significant. Out of the 97 replications of these 97 original positive results, 35 results were positive and statistically significant. And if you look at the figure here to the left, you have the p-values of the 100 original studies and of the 100 replications. And for the original studies here, you see that something magical is definitely happening at p less than 0.05, but there's nothing happening at p equals to 0.05 for the 100 replications. We did something very inspired by the psychology project, but for experimental economics. So we went through 2 top econ journals, the American Economic Review and Quarterly Journal of Economics, searched for all experimental papers that tested a main effect, tested a hypothesis, and did not have any interaction here. We found 18 such papers in the time period 2011 to 2014, and we replicate these studies with high power. So we have 90% power to detect 100% of the original effect size at p less than 0.05. And what do we find here? Using the same replication criteria as before, we find that 11 out of 18 studies replicate. We then went on and looked at studies published in Nature and Science. So these are supposed to be our top general science journals. So we searched for all experimental social science studies published in time period 2010 to 2015. We found 21 such studies that tested a clear hypothesis in a between or within subject design using students or other accessible subject pools. We have substantially higher power in these replications. So we do a 2-stage replication procedure. We do a first round of replication where we collect data so that we have 90% power to detect 75% of the original effect size. If the study does not replicate, then we move to a second stage of data collection so that we have 90% power to detect 50% of the original effect size. This leads to sample sizes that are about 4 times as big as if we were going for 90% power to detect 100% of the original effect size. So that was a lot of percentages and numbers. The summary of that is that we have a lot higher power here than in the previous projects, and that's a good thing. Then we can be more sure of not getting false negative results. So what do we find? You can look at the stage 2 results on your right. In blue, we have successful replication outcomes, meaning that the study replicates. In yellow, we have failed replications. And here, with the statistical significance criterion, meaning that we find an effect in the same direction as the original study that is statistically significant, we find that 13 out of 21 studies replicate. We shouldn't expect 21 out of 21 to replicate necessarily, but 13 out of 21 is a bit disappointing. We can also look at mean relative effect size. how big is the replication's effect size compared to the original effect? For the 13 studies that replicate according to this binary criterion, mean relative effect size is 74%. For the 8 studies that do not replicate, mean relative effect size is 0%. So for these projects, we've also set up something called prediction markets. And in the crowd of economists, I think most people know what prediction markets are, but let's spend a minute talking about these. So these are typically platforms or information aggregation tools used to aggregate information. So a normal type of contract in these markets would be to bet on some political outcome. Who would become president? Who will win some election? So you have some well-defined outcome and not always, but often some binary event. So here on the slide, you can see an example of prediction markets for who becomes president in 2008 in the US. So a contract here in Obama becoming president is worth $1 if he becomes president and $0 if he does not become president. So with some caveats, we can interpret the price of this type of contract as the probability that the market assigns this event. So what probability does the market think Obama has in becoming president? In this particular example, the price is 91.5 cents for this contract. If you think that the probability is higher, you should buy this contract or short sell the opponent. If you think the probability is lower, you should short sell this contract or buy the opponent's contract. So there are many studies looking at prediction markets for politics, sports events, etc. And they typically, but not always, find that prediction markets perform better than election polls in predicting election outcomes, because these markets are not about who you want to win, they're about who you think will win. So you will bet according to your beliefs, which is a function of all the information you have from peers, newspapers, etc. So potentially you can get a lot more information here than from a poll asking 1,000 people who they will vote for. So we use prediction markets in the various replication projects. So we set these markets up, invite researchers that are working on related questions as the replication studies, as the studies that we are replicating. We give them money between $1,500 US, not a lot of money, but some to make it a little bit more interesting. And then we set up markets and have participants, researchers, bet on the replication outcomes for up to 2 weeks. It's up to them how much time they want to spend here. Before they enter our prediction markets, we ask them in a survey, what probability do you assign that the study will replicate? So we are not asking them the question, do you believe in this study? We ask them, do you think the study will replicate? Which is, of course, a different thing. So we've done these prediction markets for the projects that I mentioned earlier, plus a few other ones. And we have lots of more work that is at other stages, so I can't present it yet. So participants trade these contracts in the studies that we are replicating. A contract here is worth $1 if the study replicates and $0 if it does not replicate. And we interpret the price of these contracts as the probability that the market assigns the study replicating. We give participants a lot of information so they can read about the original study, the replication study, what we do differently, what our planned sample sizes are, etc., to be as well informed as possible. And we start prices at 50, and then they can potentially go up or down depending on how people are betting in these markets. So what do we find? So here I've aggregated the results for several of these projects that I've mentioned. So we have 123 studies that are replicated here. We have prediction market prices for these 123 studies, and we have survey responses from the same researchers for these 123 studies. In the simplest type of analysis, we say that the market thinks that the study will replicate if the price is above 50. Otherwise, the market thinks that the study will not replicate. So we draw a line at 50 here for these prediction market prices and survey beliefs. And in this figure in black, we have successfully replicated studies, and in blank, we have studies that failed to replicate. And as you see, there are more black dots above 50 than below, and more white dots below 50 than above. We have a 72% correct prediction rate for the prediction markets and a 64% correct prediction rate for the surveys. So there seems to be some type of wisdom of crowd here, but it's not perfect. So prediction markets shouldn't outcompete actually doing the replications, but we can learn something from them potentially in a world where we can't replicate everything. So what have we learned from these studies? Original studies, even those that report true positive results, will overestimate the effect sizes of true positives. So that's something to consider when we do meta-analysis. We probably had less power than intended in the earlier replication projects. So we should consider that when moving forward. Replication indicators converge with higher power. That's a good thing. And there is something systematic about results that successfully replicate versus fail to replicate. And researchers are pretty good at picking this up. And then, of course, the question is, why are we publishing these false results if most of us don't believe in them in the first place? And that's not the question that I'm particularly good at answering. And given how much we can learn from replications about whether effects are actually generalizable or replicable, are the incentives for replication appropriate? And now we're in the world of experiments. What do we do for other types of data? And that's something I will come back to. So we've also run several other types of forecasting studies where we're looking at replications and new hypotheses and trying to predict the outcomes of these studies. And in these projects, we're basically doing like elaborate surveys where we're asking researchers to predict the results of each study that is being performed. So they get to go through all the material of these studies, the exact framing of the questions, the research designs, etc. And the short version of this is that we find that researchers are very good at predicting results. Here's an example from a paper by Justin Landy et al., where we are co-authors from Psychological Bulletin, where the same hypothesis is given to a number of different teams, and they're asked to test this hypothesis in any way they want, designing a new experiment to test this hypothesis. There's quite some variation in results, with some groups finding a statistically significant result in one direction and some in the opposite direction. We ask researchers whether they can predict what the results are, whether there's a statistically significant result, and what the actual effect size is. And we find that researchers are good at predicting this, which again is something suggesting that there is some wisdom of crowds. Okay, so leaving the world of predicting research outcomes, the final project I would like to mention is something where we do a so-called many analysts study. So the focus here is to look at the variation in results when lots of research groups are given the same data and asked to test the same hypothesis. So we, and by we, I mean our collaborators at Tel Aviv University, collected fMRI data from 108 participants who were making choices under risk in the fMRI. This gave us a lot of data. This is a pretty large study for an fMRI study. And we then gave this data to 70 different teams who were asked to analyze the data and test the same 9 directional hypotheses. Our main outcome variable is whether the team reported a statistically significant result or not. So we look at the fraction of teams that find a statistically significant result in line with the hypothesis for each of these 9 hypotheses. You can now see the 9 hypotheses and come back to these slides later, but these hypotheses probably won't mean much to you if you're not neuroscientists, so I would skip this slide. So what do we find? We find quite some variation in what these different teams result. In terms of what these research teams find, whether they find something statistically significant in support of the hypothesis or not. For a few of these, for 4 of the hypotheses, we're fairly close to 0% in terms of the fraction of teams reporting a statistically significant result, or fairly close to 1. But for the other 5 hypotheses, we're somewhere in between complete conformity and complete chaos in what the teams are reporting. On average, 20% of teams will be disagreeing with the majority of teams here. So depending on sort of which researcher you ask a question, you can get a very different result. So that's sort of the point of this study, to show that even when we're testing the same hypothesis with the same data, we can get a lot of variation. We can't address here what the correct analysis is, so that's something to consider for future research. So some other thoughts, given that I have a couple of minutes left before my time's up. I think solutions and ways forward are to do more so-called pre-analysis plans. I think that's one of the key solutions, especially for us doing experiments. So we write ahead of time what tests we're going to do, how we're collecting data, everything that we can say in advance. We can still do exploratory tests, so test new things that we didn't plan, explore so-called novel, innovative, creative results, surprising results. But we should present them as exploratory and not confirmatory, which is a sort of common problem, that exploratory things are presented as confirmatory. Maybe we should do more multiverse analysis. So we do all potential analysis on the data and not just sort of our preferred analysis, which often happens to show something statistically significant. We should think more about having high statistical power. Maybe we should do more team science, so we collaborate in larger groups. But all of these are fairly hard things to do when you think about the incentive structure in academia. So that's something to come back to. So for pre-analysis plans, yes, I think that's a clear way forward, especially for experimental work in the lab. It should also work well in the field and in many other instances. But there are of course questions and analysis that are hard to do with pre-analysis plans. You already know the data, or the data is so complex that it's very hard to write a convincing pre-analysis plan ahead of time because you don't really know what variables you will have and what they will look like, etc. Maybe then we should do these multiverse analysis instead. Maybe Statistics Sweden, who many of us get data from, should just give us a subset of the data so we kind of get to know that data and can then commit to an analysis for the large remaining part of the data. That would be a way to sort of show convincing p-values, which is something many of us are interested in doing. And I think this is particularly important to think of for non-experimental data, because the degrees of freedom in how to do the analysis are typically way larger than for experimental data. When you have an experiment, you've designed the study in order to test something very specific. You don't have a million variables. You have clear causality, etc., which is typically not the case for non-experimental data. I also think registered reports are a way forward. So registered reports are getting bigger and bigger in psychology and medicine. And I think we should be looking at these other fields to learn more in economics. Registered reports are basically like enhanced pre-analysis plans that are reviewed by peer reviewers before any data is collected. So now reviewers have a chance to say what they think about the design and the planned analysis and everything. But the paper is accepted no matter what the results actually are. So you submit your pre-analysis plan, extended, get it approved or not. And then once you have the results, the paper will be published no matter the results. So this is a way to get rid of publication bias. And in economics, as far as I know, there's just one journal that has a permanent track of this, and that's Journal of Development Economics. And there should be more such journals. Last slide. I think that we should change the statistical significance threshold to p less than 0.005. I know this is not a very popular idea, besides among the 72 authors of this paper. Magnus Henrekson played a way more important role in this paper than I did. So this is another arbitrary but meaningful threshold for statistical significance. And if you want to read more about this, read this paper, Redefine Statistical Significance, that was published a few years ago. So all comments and questions, please email them to me. You have my email address here, and looking forward to discussing this in different ways in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this very interesting discussion, and maybe a bit frustrating for empirical economists, I guess, increasing the threshold by a factor of 10. Is that right? Yeah. So anyway, I'm not going to take the word, so I'm going to give the word to Stefan Svallfors. And Stefan is a professor at the Södertörns University College, and very importantly in this case, Secretary General for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the Swedish Research Council. So please, Stefan.
Thank you. Actually, my current institutional affiliation is with the Institute for Future Studies and no longer with Södertörns University. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss with you, Anna, the invitation that I received, and many congratulations on your award. I think that the contribution that Anna has made is really important. It can't be kind of overstated. I think it focuses on one part of a larger set of threats against scientific integrity. Other examples are, as you pointed out, sheer fabrication, but you also have things like an unwillingness to make a distinction between researcher and activist. You have symbiotic relationships between funders and stakeholders on the one hand and researchers on the other. And there are other examples. And some of these are kind of external to the scientific community. They come from the outside in a sense, but some of them are clearly internal to our own practices. And I think the ones you are dealing with are really the ones that are internal to the scientific community. I would like to focus my comments, and I actually only have three major comments. I will focus them on what should be done given Anna's findings and arguments. And I have no good answers myself to these questions, but I hope that you will provide them. So my first set of questions is related to how you see the role in hyper competition in creating these unfortunate outcomes. And with hyper competition, I mean a kind of competition structure that has a kind of winner take all type of competition. Few attractive positions, extremely hierarchical structure, etc. And we see that in many places, and I do think that among the social sciences that economics is perhaps particularly afflicted by this hyper competition. There is a kind of imperative to publish in a few select journals. You have a kind of international circulation of postdocs that you don't find in other places. Many young researchers need striking results to get ahead. So my question is there a kind of goal conflict between, let's say, excellence and soundness? What if anything should be done about hyper competition?
Okay, so that's a super good and a hard question. So, I mean, the short answer is, of course, yes, I think that this type of competition and that has effects on the credibility of results, and that there is some type of trade-off between excellence as measured just by sort of where the results are published versus sort of how interesting, important, and credible are these results. So there is probably some trade-off. Whether this is specific to economics is hard for me to say. I think there is something similar or historically that has happened in psychology, where if you publish a paper in Nature Science or psychological science that nobody can replicate, you're still set. You will still get that position. And I think that applies to many departments and many groups and many fields, and not just economics, though our top journals are different from their top journals. So I think there is, we have some sort of structural problem here. How do we solve this? I'm not really sure. So I think that most people that enter academia, in particular do research, they start because they want to seek some truth. They're out to explore how the world works. And then we all react to incentives. So we can't just think about finding out the truth. We also have to think about publishing. And we would like to think that we are finding out the truth while we are also publishing our results. But then we get to these various phenomena, p-hacking and forking, that are so natural. And we, I think, fool ourselves as much as we fool others typically into thinking that we have found something, whereas in fact we haven't. And sort of we should be worried when in top journals, etc., we don't see null results. Like noisy null results are probably the truest results we have, not even clear null results. And these will sort of be lacking in many literatures. And then something is obviously wrong. How problematic is this? I guess that depends on sort of career incentives, which are a bit different across departments, universities, fields, etc. I'm not sure exactly that was exactly an answer to your question, but I think competition plays a role. I mean, competition can play a role just by if you have many teams testing the same hypothesis, nobody is doing anything wrong. There is no researcher degrees of freedom, but we're all testing the same hypothesis. We have fairly low power, and this hypothesis has a low prior, and we have publication bias. Ioannidis' 2005 paper shows that this can lead to situations where a majority of actually published results will be false. And nobody's trying to do anything bad here, but we end up in situations where we can't really trust the literature. So I don't think, I really believe in the so-called scientific method. I think science is the way to get to the truth for many questions. But we can, and so we shouldn't sort of skip doing research, but we can improve this process and try to make sure we don't publish as many false results as we have in the past, and weed out false positive results earlier. I mean, it's fine to publish some false positive results, and I have some that I think now are false positive results, but we should find them earlier and make sure that they're not being cited to the same extent as true results, etc. So that's also an interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, and I mean one kind of little thing that could be done is to make the research community look less on exactly where things are published and look more on what is actually published. And I mean, I don't want to come across as somebody who believes that we should have no competition in research. I think it's a kind of inbuilt element, and as long as it's kind of kept within reasonable boundaries, it's a good thing with competition. But as in many other cases, you don't know what's enough until you know what's more than enough. And I think more than enough has been reached in some fields of research. But let me move to my second question, which is kind of a worry I have with or at least a potential worry with some of the solutions that you suggest. And my question is that, is there a risk of kind of bureaucratize and juridify the research process? And I think in terms of kind of following the rules, ticking all the boxes, sticking to the plan, is there a risk that comes into conflict with the creativity, the sudden lightning of insight, moving beyond what was originally conceived, etc.? Is there a second goal conflict here between, let's say, creativity and prudence, and how do you balance those?
So another good question. So I hear that a lot when it comes to when people are discussing costs of pre-analysis plans, that this would hinder sort of the exploration of new interesting insights that you hadn't planned ahead of time. So I think a pre-analysis plan doesn't stop anyone from doing something exploratory, but it makes it super clear what is exploratory versus what is confirmatory. I mean, I think the big problem now is that we have tons of just exploratory tests being presented as confirmatory. So if you do a pre-analysis plan, I think we need to get to some norm where reviewers, first of all, do not need to read the pre-analysis plan, because they don't. And then you have no real incentives to follow the pre-analysis plan. So if we're going to have pre-analysis plans, which I think we should have, we have to have some well-functioning norm around pre-analysis plans. So I suggest that you have a pre-analysis plan. You have your primary tests, secondary tests, robustness tests, exploratory tests. You also write up the paper according to these categories of tests. And then you can say, we have something completely exploratory here. We didn't expect to look into this or to find this, but this is what we find. That can be super interesting and hypothesis generating for that research group, but also for others who read it. And I think that's completely, then it's not, we're not killing anything creative here, and we shouldn't be killing any new discoveries, but we just sort of make clear what's confirmatory and what's exploratory. And I sort of, maybe there are some costs somewhere other that I can see for pre-analysis plans, but the benefits are so big if what we care about is actually reliable results, like meaningful p-values, then we should be considering pre-analysis plans. And I think that funding agencies should at least encourage pre-analysis plans if they're not sort of saying that they're necessary for certain types of projects. So my worry is that people talk about pre-analysis plans for experimental data, but for other types of data, there are not many discussions about pre-analysis plans. So I think what many people should be focusing on now is how do we make sure that we get reliable results from non-experimental data. Not sure that pre-analysis plans are the solution there, but there will probably be others, like multiverse analysis, getting parts of the data and committing to an analysis for the rest, etc. I mean, what are we after at the end of the day? Hopefully finding results we can trust, I think.
Yeah,
not expecting that 100% of them will ever be true, and that's fine. I mean, that would be weird. We shouldn't expect that in any way, but we shouldn't expect 50% to be false if we have p less than 0.05 for all of these results.
Well, thank you. A very, very good answer, I think. My last real set of question is how you see the role of rules in this area compared to, let's say, the role of culture, or if you like, you could also phrase it as a question of incentives versus norms, because I do think that the malpractices that we talk about, they are a cultural problem, in the sense that researchers no longer care about, or care much less about, truth, exciting discoveries, etc., these kind of intrinsic rewards in the research process. They care only, or at least mostly, about careers, admiration, status, those kind of extrinsic rewards that you can get from research. And my question is, does really, let's say, setting the incentives right, does that really solve this, or does it actually make it worse?
Yeah, so another good question. I don't know if I have the best answer to this, but I think most of us react to both these types of extrinsic incentives. We care about career. We want to be able to stay in academia if that's what we're interested in and like. So we will try to get the publications that are needed for this. But I think most of us, of course, want to get to some truth. And then we can p-hack and fool ourselves into thinking that that was exactly the analysis we had always planned to do. So I don't think most people would even sort of consider that they're doing some type of trade-off between career and truth. So I think we use some type of motivated reasoning for convincing ourselves that we have found the truth when we have forked or p-hacked or something. I think that's supernatural. So I think most people want to do good things, and I think we should do maybe a mix of changing rules and culture. I think sort of teaching junior researchers, master students, PhD students, etc., early on how to think about pre-analysis plans and statistical power and other things will be super rewarding. Then we have to make sure, of course, that when they go on the job market with maybe no results, that they're not punished for that, because the no results are very likely to be credible because they come from pre-analysis plans, etc. So, I mean, I think we can change culture. And if you look at a field like psychology, things have changed quite dramatically in real time. I think there's been a little bit of an unfair focus on psychology. So many studies have failed to replicate there. But one reason that we know this is because these are studies that people can replicate, that we can redo these experiments. So there's a way sort of to test this. And in psychology, pre-analysis plans are now becoming the norm. Registered reports are way more common. There are tons of other discussions happening in psychology. So we in economics, sociology, political science should be looking at psychology. And it feels like when you go to psychology departments and talk to junior researchers, there's been a cultural shift. And you see this among some senior researchers too, but I think it's sort of, the change will happen at the more junior level. And then we have to make sure sort of, is the incentive structure correct for them? Like, will they, when they apply for assistant professorship jobs or try to get tenure, will they be rewarded for having tried to get reliable results that might not end up in flashy journals because they're not claiming that power posing has these dramatic effects? So I think, and I'm not the right person to answer that question. So I think the Research Council should be thinking about these questions.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's a very broad issue about how we form and sustain a kind of sound research culture. What mix of norms, incentives, exemplars, etc. do we need here? And one thing that I do think I know for certain is that the role of openness is absolutely crucial here. I mean, having open access to data, etc., that increases the likelihood that kind of strange and weird and false results will be weeded out, but it also helps researchers sticking on the narrow path, because if all data is available, somebody will at some point discover kind of a data massage in this broad sense. So these were my only three real questions, and then I have a kind of a mock question to end my discussion with, and that is the question: what if all the experiments that you tried to replicate, if they actually had replicated, what would that have done to your own career?
Well, then I probably would have been focusing on other questions. I mean, a few years ago, I was mainly interested in gender differences in economic preferences. Before that, more about the cooperation and altruism. Now it's this. Who knows what it's in 5 years? And I mean, that's a fantastic part of being in research, right? You can change preferences, explore new questions.
Yeah.
So who
Thank
knows?
you very much. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much, both Anna and Stefan, for your talks and for the discussion you've had. And we are about to finish. And on behalf of the Swedish Economic Association, I'd like to send a word to Assar Lindbeck and everything that his memory and what he's done for us during. He's been ansvarig utgivare för ekonomisk debatt for 48 years, and it's been very, very important. And one way to show this is to give this medal every 2 years in his memory now. And we wish you all the best, Anna. And I'm pretty sure I'm totally sure that you will find very interesting issues to dig into in the future. So we look forward to that too. So thank you very much. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And goodbye.
Bye.